Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're going deep, and I mean deep, into the work of a guy whose name you might not know off the top of your head, but whose fingerprints are all over the way we think about art, literature, language, you name it. August Wilhelm von Schlegel, born back in 1767, essayist, critic, translator, philosopher, poet, the list goes on. And we haven't even mentioned that he was a key figure in the German Romantic movement and a huge reason why those big romantic ideas spread all across Europe, especially in Britain.
It's amazing how, for someone who was so influential, the philosophical side of his work often gets, well, kind of overlooked.
Yeah. People focus on the romanticism, the translations, but there's this whole layer of deep thinking going on that deserves another look. Let's unpack this. What do you say?
Absolutely. Once you really dig into Schlegel, you realize just how incredibly wide-ranging his knowledge was. I mean, he wasn't just a literature guy. You've got art, history, architecture, anthropology, and on top of all that, he was fluent in a crazy number of languages.
It makes you wonder how he even had time to sleep.
Right. And the thing is, from a philosophical standpoint, his work in comparative literature, studying different literary traditions across cultures, and his early contributions to linguistics were groundbreaking. He was already thinking about these connections and structures in language that were pretty radical for his time.
He was way ahead of the curve. And it wasn't just about Europe for him. This is the guy who basically single-handedly launched Sanskrit studies in Germany with his Indisch Bibliothek journal. Not just reading about it, but actually creating a whole new field of study. Plus, let's not forget about his amazing translations, especially his versions of Shakespeare, which are still considered the gold standard in German today.
And it's worth pointing out, those translations were a lot more than just a language swap. He was really bringing new artistic ideas and dramatic styles into German culture. Think about the impact of introducing Shakespeare with all his complex characters and rule-breaking plots to an audience that was used to a very different kind of theater.
It's like a cultural earthquake. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is really try to get to the core of Schlegel's thinking, to bring out those surprising insights that made him such a game changer and figure out why his ideas are still so relevant, even if we don't always realize it.
So you could say the big question for any philosopher looking at Schlegel is this: how did one person with so many different interests manage to have such a lasting impact on intellectual history? It's almost a philosophical question in itself, isn't it?
It is. And maybe just to start answering that, we need to trace the path of his life and work. Where do we even begin with a guy like this?
Well, he was born in Hanover, right? Started out studying theology, which I guess is a good foundation for philosophy in a way. But then, luckily for us, he switched gears to philology and aesthetics at Göttingen University.
And that's where he met some pretty important people. I mean, Wilhelm von Humboldt was there, a big name in linguistics and philosophy. And there's also Caroline Michaelis, who later became Caroline Boomer. Sources suggest she was a pretty big influence on Schlegel, especially when it came to his Shakespeare translations and his early ideas about romantic theory.
Right. Ernst Baylor really emphasizes that point. It seems like their relationship was a genuine intellectual partnership, even in those early stages.
A meeting of the minds. So then he heads to Jena, which becomes like the epicenter of the early Romantic movement. It's this incredible gathering of some of the brightest minds of the time. Schlegel's brother Friedrich, Novalis, Tieck, Schelling. It's hard to even imagine the kind of conversations that must have been happening there.
And it was during this Jena period that a lot of the key romantic ideas really started to crystallize. It was a time of huge philosophical and artistic change. These guys were basically trying to redefine art, literature, and even reality itself, pushing back against the dominant classical and Enlightenment thinking. They were asking, what's the role of imagination? What about feeling?
And out of this intellectual explosion comes the Athenaeum in 1798, the journal he founded with his brother Friedrich. But this wasn't just any old literary magazine. They used it as a platform to promote their romantic views on literature and to critique the old-school classicist approaches.
And even the format was different. They mixed critical essays with fragments of ideas, letters, dialogues. It's almost like you can feel the energy of these ongoing conversations jumping off the page.
Yeah. You can see why they called the leading publication of the early Romantics. And for a philosopher, this wasn't just a journal, it was a statement, a challenge to the status quo. Then came the lectures, first in Jena, then Berlin, and finally in Vienna. These lectures were hugely influential, helping to spread Romantic ideas all over Europe.
Especially the Vienna lectures, they were translated into a bunch of languages, which helped them reach a much wider audience.
He even said that people were reading his work from Cadiz to St. Petersburg, and even in North America and Asia. That's global reach. And of course, his life wasn't just about lectures. He traveled with Madame de Stael, a very important intellectual in her own right, after separating from Caroline, and later he took a professorship in Bonn. All these experiences kept him connected to the big intellectual debates of his time.
Absolutely. All those connections and interactions would have been crucial in shaping how his ideas were received and spread.
Okay, and we can't forget about the insane amount of translating he did. Shakespeare, Calderon, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Cervantes, Tasso, Camões, and he even did the first complete translation of the Bhagavad Gita from Sanskrit to Latin. That's mind-blowing.
It really is. It shows how deeply he was committed to understanding different cultures and ways of thinking. And from a philosophical standpoint, it raises all sorts of interesting questions about whether ideas and concepts can really be translated across different languages and cultures. Especially his work with Sanskrit opened up a whole new world of philosophical thinking for European intellectuals.
And then, how was his work received, you ask? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. He definitely got recognition while he was alive, especially because of his lectures and translations. He even oversaw the publication of his collected essays.
But there was a period, sadly, where his work was kind of unfairly ignored, partly because of some pretty harsh criticism from the poet Heinrich Heine.
Yeah, it's like those critiques overshadowed a lot of his other contributions.
Yeah.
Luckily, in recent times, there's been a renewed interest in all the different facets of his work. So now, let's dive into his impact on Romanticism, both in Germany and across Europe. One thing that stands out in our sources is how much the Romantics believed in collaboration. While they definitely valued individual genius, they also really emphasized this idea of symphilosophieren and philosophizing together.
The Athenaeum is a great example of that.
Exactly. So, how does this idea of working together to develop ideas challenge the traditional view of, like, the lone genius philosopher?
Well, it kind of undermines the idea that intellectual progress happens just because of isolated geniuses having brilliant ideas in a vacuum. It's much more of a back and forth, a dialogue within a community of thinkers.
And Schlegel was right in the middle of all of this, not just explaining, but also popularizing those big romantic principles, including the very word romantic itself. Of course, this whole movement was a reaction to what they saw as the limitations of classicism, with its focus on imitation and against the strict rationalism of the Enlightenment.
You know, the Romantics were basically trying to rebalance things. They wanted to bring emotion, imagination, intuition, and spirituality back into the equation.
What's interesting is how Schlegel went about defining romantic. He wasn't just throwing the word around. He was actually trying to give it a clear meaning, to establish it as a defining feature of modern thought. He saw it not as a complete rejection of classical ideas, but as a different, equally important way of achieving great things in art and literature. What do you make of that?
I think it shows how aware they were of trying to create something new while still acknowledging the past. It wasn't about erasing history, but building on it in a new way.
And his influence didn't stop at the German border. His lectures got translated, thanks in part to Madame de Stael, and had a huge impact on English Romanticism, especially on guys like Coleridge. But here's something a little strange. Our sources say that Schlegel himself was kind of pessimistic about whether his work would have a lasting impact. Why do you think that is for someone so influential?
You know, it's funny how sometimes the people closest to a big intellectual movement can miss the forest for the trees. Maybe he was just too close to the criticisms and debates of his time to see the big picture.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about his philosophy of art. One of his big ideas was that art isn't just about reflecting nature. It's actually a creative force in its own right. This is a big departure from that old mimetic theory that goes all the way back to Aristotle.
But he didn't just throw out the concept of nature altogether.
Right. He had a much more nuanced view, using Spinoza's distinction between naturans nature as this active creative force and naturata nature as the world we see around us. How does bringing Spinoza into the picture change how we think about art and nature?
Well, it's not about just copying nature anymore. It's about understanding that art and nature share the same creative principle. Naturans is that vital energy, that force that makes everything happen. And Schlegel argued that true artistic genius taps into that same energy.
So when he said that famous line, art should imitate nature, he wasn't saying, go paint a pretty landscape. He was saying, create something with that same organic unity, that same expression of eternal truth that we see in the natural world.
It's about capturing the essence, the process of creation, not just the outward appearance.
And this brings us to his idea of romantic art and this longing for a lost unity with nature. He saw art as an embodiment of truth, but not necessarily beauty in the classical sense. Instead, it's often about expressing this deep longing, what he calls Sehnsucht, for this original connection with nature. He contrasted ancient poetry, which was more focused on the present moment and sensual pleasure, with modern poetry, which is all about this yearning, this desire for something more.
Yeah, he attributed that shift to the influence of Christianity and this growing sense of separation between the finite world and the infinite.
So modern art becomes this attempt to bridge that gap, to find that lost unity again. How does this idea of Sehnsucht as the driving force change how we think about aesthetics?
Well, it brings in this sense of restlessness, this yearning that's pretty different from the classical ideas of harmony and balance. It's like beauty isn't something static anymore. It's about the pursuit of something you might never fully reach.
And then there's his concept of the poetical and how he critiques art. He saw the essence of art, this poetical quality, as something that goes beyond the surface, something deeper. He even said that genius is this almost unconscious choice of the highest degree of excellence, recognizing how much of artistic creation comes from a place we can't fully explain.
I think every artist has experienced that. Those moments where something just clicks and you're not even sure how it happened.
Right. And he distinguished between style, which is this intuitive, almost divinely inspired way of creating, and mannerism, which is what happens when the artist's personality gets in the way. For Schlegel, the poetical was this ability to reach beyond reality, to connect with eternal truths. Art's power is in how it takes us beyond the everyday world, not just in how well it copies it.
He valued wholeness, unity, originality, that ability to create a complete world within the work of art itself.
Exactly. And even like the use of masks and emotional distance in theater. It was all part of creating this separate world on stage. He loved how old comedy was so self-aware of its own artificiality. He thought dramatic poetry was especially powerful because it taps into our natural tendency to imitate. And when it shows us morally and intellectually significant actions, it becomes even more meaningful. Tragedy for him was about showing us a noble view of humanity, not just about purging emotions. And while he was critical of some German theater in his time, he was a huge fan of guys like Lessing, Schiller, and Goethe.
And it's interesting how all this feeds into his philosophy of language. In his letters on poetry, Silenus and Ion, he explored how language began. He presented two contrasting ideas. One, that language started as a way to label things in the world, and two, that it came from expressing our emotions.
It makes sense that he wouldn't just settle for one simple explanation.
Yeah, he was skeptical of purely rational explanations. He thought we need to consider metaphor and intuition to understand how language really works. And ultimately, he said, figuring out how language began is just as mysterious as figuring out where humans came from in the first place.
He saw language as having these two sides. One that's irrational, emotional, imaginative, sensual, and one that's rational, like a system with rules. Does that resonate with how linguists and philosophers think about language today?
Absolutely. There's still this ongoing debate about how much of language is about expressing ourselves and how much is about conveying information clearly. And his focus on metaphor and intuition challenges the idea that language is just a purely logical tool.
And for Schlegel, language wasn't just about practical communication. It was at the very heart of what makes us human. He argued that while animals might communicate basic feelings, human language goes way beyond that.
It's how we make sense of the world, how we connect with each other, how we become individuals.
He even suggested that the world only has meaning for us because of language. It's how we create our reality and how we think about ourselves. Pretty profound stuff, right? And get this. He said that language is basically poetry. He thought it probably started with sounds, like animal cries or bird songs, but then humans added rhythm and meaning. The earliest languages were probably inseparable from music and dance. And he believed that this poetic, rhythmic aspect is still there in all language, even when we're just talking about everyday things.
Wow. So language is like this ongoing poem that humanity is always creating.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And he gave poets and translators a lot of credit for shaping and enriching language, keeping it alive and vibrant. He pointed out the tension between the creative side of language, how artists use it, and the grammatical side, how it's structured and organized. It's kind of like Saussure's later ideas about Lang and Perrault, the system and the act of speaking.
So there's this constant push and pull between order and creativity.
Yeah. And he even suggested that all our interactions with the world are poetical in a way, meaning we're always creating meaning, interpreting things through language, not just passively receiving information. He tied this into his theory of mythology, arguing that mythology is a basic way humans make sense of the world. He called language the most wonderful creation of human beings' poetical talent. It's how we think about ourselves, how we understand our place in the universe. And he saw poetry as the most free and powerful form of art, able to create its own worlds and realities.
Poetry in poetry. I like that.
Right. And he even said that even when we're not intentionally writing poetry, our everyday speech still has this unconscious poetic quality to it, which is kind of similar to what Nietzsche would say later on.
So much food for thought.
I know. Now let's talk about his translation theory. This is interesting because even though Schlegel translated tons of work, he said he didn't have a fixed system for translation. He was definitely influenced by Herder, but he believed every text is different and needs a different approach. He thought abstract theories weren't very useful unless you're actually down in the trenches, wrestling with the words.
Sounds very practical.
Very. His main goal wasn't to translate literally, but to capture the true spirit of the original, all those innumerable, indescribable marvels that go beyond the surface meaning. He wanted people who couldn't read the original to get as close to the real thing as possible. And he wasn't into making foreign texts sound weird or awkward in the new language.
He wanted to create a bridge, not a wall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He criticized translators who made things sound too artificial, and he really wanted to introduce foreign ideas in a way that felt natural. He even talked about how abstract concepts evolve over time, which makes finding the right translation tricky. He famously called translating voluntary and embarrassing slavery a thankless craft because you can never achieve perfect equivalence. And even his translations got criticized, some people accusing him of romanticizing Shakespeare, but others still consider his versions to be the best ever done in German.
It's a reminder that translation is both an art and a science. There's always going to be an element of interpretation involved.
Right. And finally, let's talk about the role of the critic in Schlegel's work and his ideas about nationalism, which are kind of complicated. He saw the critic's job as being different from the artist's. The critic's role was to explain, to educate, even to provide a moral perspective on art. He said, art needs the discourse of art history for its artistry to become visible. A good critic, for Schlegel, needed to be sensitive and have a deep understanding of art, but also understand its historical and cultural context to guide public taste and help people appreciate new art forms.
He was a big believer in educating the public.
Well, he was.
Yeah.
And he wanted to free readers from what he called despotism in taste, from those narrow provincial views, and from getting caught up in passing fads. He wanted to prepare them for a truly great German Romantic theater. He emphasized how important it is to understand the history and culture behind a work of art, to connect theory and experience. The ideal critic, he said, needed to be able to set aside their own preferences and appreciate all the different kinds of art that humans have created throughout history.
Yeah, pretty high standards.
Yeah. He considered his own lectures to be a form of critique, and he recognized how hard it is to find the right words, like the word romantic itself, to capture the essence of a whole era. By 1828, he noticed that European tastes were shifting towards Romanticism, and he felt like his work as a critic had contributed to that.
And this is where his nationalism comes in, right? It's interesting how it kind of clashes with his more cosmopolitan views.
Exactly. He wanted to make foreign literature accessible to Germans, but he also wanted to defend and promote German culture. He encouraged Germans to embrace their own history and identity, and he even defended German writers and philosophers against criticism from the English. He argued that Germany was a leading force in European culture because of its contributions to science, philosophy, and its understanding of the classics.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? Appreciating different cultures while also promoting your own.
It really is. And I think it shows how he was caught up in the same romantic spirit he was trying to analyze.
Maybe it's impossible to be completely objective when you're talking about something so close to your own heart.
Maybe. But I think that tension makes his work even more interesting to study. Now, all this leads us to consider Schlegel as a thinker of difference. He was fascinated by the other, women, children, people from different cultures. He believed in connecting abstract ideas to real-world experience and understanding the historical context of everything.
He saw the value in difference itself, which is key to understanding his use of the term romantic.
Exactly. He appreciated different forms of art because of, not in spite of, their differences. He definitely preferred modern poetry, but he didn't judge it solely by comparing it to ancient poetry. He was basically a pioneer of comparative literature. His goal wasn't to say what's beautiful or not, but to help people understand and appreciate all the different ways humans have expressed themselves artistically throughout history.
It's a much more inclusive way of thinking about art.
It is. And he applied this same appreciation for difference to art criticism. He criticized critics who didn't like the way art sometimes mixes reality and illusion. He thought it was important for the viewer to be aware of how art is constructed, of the difference between what's real and what's not. That was really important to his defense of things like verse and masks in theater.
He saw irony as a way of highlighting how fluid and constructed those boundaries between reality and illusion really are.
Exactly. And in a way, some sources suggest his thinking about art, history, language, and culture was actually pretty ahead of its time, more like a postmodern understanding. They compare him to thinkers like Nietzsche, Blumenberg, and Deleuze.
That's an interesting connection.
So, to wrap things up, August Wilhelm von Schlegel was way more than just someone who spread romantic ideas. He was a central figure in shaping those ideas. His contributions to art theory, literary criticism, philosophy of language, translation, and our understanding of culture are really impressive.
He deserves to be recognized for his own original thinking, not just for popularizing Romanticism.
Totally, he was a pioneer. And his work reminds us to look beyond surface-level comparisons and really try to understand the historical, cultural, and linguistic context behind art and ideas.
It's about digging deeper.
It is. And here's a final thought for you. Given how much Schlegel emphasized the creative, poetical nature of language and how we interact with the world, how do you think that perspective could change or enrich how we understand truth and reality today? Especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with different perspectives and experiences, it's definitely something to think about.
I'll be pondering that one for a while, that's for sure.
Until next time, folks, keep exploring.